So this is just a short thing because we're going to have some other stuff about using BufferWriter for the SNI config. I'm working with Newbury and Jingzi on this. I'm Alan Carroll. I'm employee bum and other stuff. All right. So yeah, when we start BufferWriter, it was really just about writing to limited buffers. What we had was a whole bunch of code that would do all the pointer and count manipulation by hand in a bunch of different places. And I said we should automate that and just have it not have to depend on every single piece of that code being correct everywhere. So we did that initially. I added formatting later because at the time, this is like 7-8 years ago, it really wasn't around very much. I chose to make my syntax model on Python because it seemed to be proven to work and was way better than printf crap. I actually ended up adding an extension field, which is backwards compatible. You can just omit it, and it doesn't matter, but it let me do some other really cool things. And eventually I extended it so that you can really get your hands on the mechanisms of the formatting. So you can do very nice things to change how stuff is generated. So the key features that we get out of BufferWriter that are actually used, wrapper-based formatting, so that I can take a time t and I can wrap it in a date class. And the whole purpose of the date class is to say, okay, I want to format this as a date. Rather than as an int t, without having to create other sorts of special stuff or more special classes. The wrapper classes are very simple. I want an argument tuple support. In C++, they want to move away from all the vararg stuff with the VA list and all of that sort of stuff and use argument tuples. That with variadic templates and argument tuples, that is the way forward in C++. So I wanted to put that in. So the prints is also print v's, where you can pass in your argument tuple. And this makes writing front ends for the formatting very simple. You can just say forward as tuple and send it off to print v. Alternative argument pack, indexed arguments. So what the arg packs do is say, okay, we've got indexed arguments. I want to pass you in something. So when you have argument 2, call me and I will tell you what argument 2 looks like. Similarly, I wanted name binding so that at the time you render the object, you can pass in a name binding to say, well, when you see this name, call this generator function to generate the output. The extension A, we talked about, this lets you have some extra context and information. If you don't care about it, you don't need it, you just ignore it. It doesn't make a problem. Override of formatter functions. I know Leif talked to me about this when I was talking about this stuff. So when you have a formatter, eventually all this stuff, for a given class, you have some formatter that formats that class. I used overloads instead of pure templates because that means your subclasses are automatically supported. If you use pure templates, then you have to do it for every subclass, which gets annoying pretty quick and generates a whole lot of symbols. So I get some pre-parsed format data, so I can pre-parse things. And it's now, I just actually made some changes for this thing I'm working on, so you can get into that and fiddle around with it, and some nested formatting. I don't know if we'll get time to do that, but you can do buff writers and buffer writers, and this actually turned out to be pretty handy in terms of sub-formatting. I don't know if I can show you a good example out of the ATS code, but there's a little bit. So this is the basic way it works. You have input text, you have an extractor. The extractor is replaceable, so you can have alternate parsers. I did this so we could support printf formats. That turned out to be really useless, but it was a request from certain users. And then you have the renderer. It gets the tokens, the specifier tokens from the extractor. You give it an argument pack for the indexed ones, you give a name binding for the name ones, and then it generates the output text. So the argument pack, the name binding, the extractor, are all replaceable. The renderer is not really replaceable, but you have these other pieces you can do to change how that all works, right? So we have this PR if you want to go look at it. So I wanted to convert the SNI tunnel destination stuff to use BWF for several reasons. One is the code is cleaner and shorter. We're not rewriting string parsing code again. You just say, parse it for me, BufferWriter, and here's the name binding I want. This means it's easy to add or modify substitutions. If we decide we want to add some other substitution for some other property, it's very simple to add that. And if we start using this in other places, we can get a much more consistent syntax, right? We can say everything looks like this Python format everywhere you do configuration files. I guess that's it. Let's go to here. So this is the actual one. We include the base converters here. The context object here is something we pass into the renderer, which is then in turn passed to the name binders. So we can put an arbitrary amount of context information that's custom to our use. The context names is provided by the base BWF. What you do is you give it a type, and it says, okay, well, in addition to the standard stuff that BufferWriter needs, also put an argument on your generators that takes a type of this type, and then we pass in the BWF context, and it gets automatically forwarded. The capture args is an arg pack, so that gives us indexing. So this is how we do the regular expression groups. We just say, well, we'll map the regular expression group number to the index, and we'll use this to actually do that. You can see we get rid of a whole lot of code here. The any capture is just something you have to do, but I should take that out. It was a mistake. I just haven't had the energy to get rid of it. Let's see. And what are we doing here? Okay, so this is the function that the arg pack has to provide to say, okay, I want argument index. You want to be able to say, well, it does the argument index validity checking, so this tells you how many it's allowed. If you wanted to handle it differently, you could return an max int here, and then just do all of the out of index handling in here if that was important. I think Zengi bugged me about that. So then we have, there's the names of our generators. Get rid of all that code. Get rid of this array here. We have to add this code. So yeah, Zengi, when I did this, I checked the original code. This is now checks at the config load time that you're not exceeding the number of capture groups. So here we go through, we do the format. This actually creates a format. Then we loop through the items of the format, and we say if it's not a literal, and then it's a substitution, and we check the item name and say if it's not in there, we'll do that error. If it's an item, if it's an index, and the count is too high, then we'll say this other error. So then at config time, we can do all that checking. And this is the actual run. We need. So if there's a format, we go and we said, here's a lambda that actually does the printing. And so what we hear is this is a print NFV. It means I want a name binding, I want a formatter, and I want an arg pack. So we bind our BW context here into our map, which does the name binding. We bind the format in, and then we pass our arg pack here. And this is more complex than it should be, because what we're doing is we're doing the double write. We're going to try on a fixed size buffer of 512. If that works, we're done. Otherwise, we're going to resize. The BufferWriter tells you how big it should have been, and we'll resize to there, and then we'll go ahead and print it again. And this time it'll work. And then off we go. And this is where we set up.
Could you have used the local BufferWriter in there with specifying the size, and then?
No, this is the BufferWriter currently always needs a fixed buffer.
But I thought okay, so I misunderstood how then it works. So I thought local BufferWriter, you're able to specify a size, and then it would expand if it needs to. Okay.
No, it won't expand. It's that big. If you say local BufferWriter, it's that big.
Okay.
If you print to a string, that's one of the things BW print does to a standard string, is it does the same technique internally, and it'll resize the standard string you pass in to be big enough. So here's how, this is our initialization. We go to our map and we say, okay, here's our name, map the receive port, here's the lambda, and see it takes this BW context, because that's what we told the name binding we wanted, and we just format stuff. And all this really does is is decide which particular piece of transaction state we want to extract to print. Everything else is pretty boilerplate. We just forwarded on. So for the capture, we go, because of the way they do it in the SNI, they don't use group 0 to mean the whole string, so it's off by 1, so I have to do this word index -1. And then we do the print, and the count is we tell it how big that is. And that's pretty much it. So here's another big chunk of code that gets rid of. Anyway, the big thing here, so you see all that, we get rid of a decent amount of code, and the key point is if we want to put in other substitutions, well, we just list them in here, and that's pretty much it. Okay, let me see if I can find one more thing here. I'm just not searching. Okay, so this right here on line 194 is an example. Oh, I need to make this bigger, don't I? 194. So this is an example of nested BufferWriter formatting. This if is another formatter, and what it says is it takes two arguments. Well, it takes n arguments. It takes a Boolean, it takes a format string, and then n args. And it says if the Boolean is true, then I'll insert the formatting. Otherwise, I'll skip it. So rather than having to create another string where you conditionally put stuff in and then copy that string in, you can just say, well, if that's true, then print that in. If it's not, then don't. So we use later to say whether we need the pipe in front of it or not, right? So when originally it's false, so we don't do that, and then we set it true, and then it prints off. So you can do fun stuff like that. Anyway, so I think that's about it. Any questions?
I know lib format does like some context per argument validation stuff. Does BufferWriter do that too?
No, I'm not really sure how you do that because, for instance, for the regexes, until you've parsed the regex that you're looking for, you have no idea what the number of capture groups is.
I don't know if it gets that deep. It's just kind of like if you provide a format specifier inside the squiggly braces, it just validates the type of that position, that kind of stuff.
No, but I mean, if you don't have a formatter, it won't compile. Right, so if you have pass a type to the format and it can't find a overload for that, then you get a compile error.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, so it's all validated in that sense that everything you're passing in has a formatter that it can call.
Yeah, everything's very type semantic. I thought it was compile time.
So it uses variadic template to say I'm going to use the types for everything, and then it creates the arg pack, which the arg pack is really a type eraser. So it says if you've got a set of arguments that are indexed, the arg pack type erases them so that again to reduce the generation of massive numbers of different templates.
Yeah.
So you have the arg pack templates and the BufferWriter invocation templates are independent, so you don't have the cross product, you have the sum. Does that make any sense?
Yep. Yeah, that part does.
Yeah. So from the renderer point of view, there is simply a base class arg pack, and it just always uses that class. And then every particular arg pack, if it has different arg sets, is a different class, but you don't get a cross product there. So anyway, now one thing I want to also point out is that I believe that the standard format and the BufferWriter formats are almost identical, and it wouldn't be much work to make them the same. We both decided that Python was the way to go, and so we built the same. It looks the same. Dealing with extensions might be hard. That's used pretty extensively for the IP address formatting to control how the IP addresses come out. You know, do you want it in hex? Do you want it in octal? Do you want it aligned? Do you want the port or the address, et cetera, et cetera? You can put extra data, formatting data in there, rather than, because you can't arbitrarily expand the set of types, format types, right? Like G and S and D. There's limited space there. I'm not sure how format deals with this. And from BufferWriter's point of view, a literal string is really just a it is treated like a substitution with a special type mark to say, oh no, don't look this name up, just print it. So you can go back post facto and detect that you have a literal and say, oh, well, I can just do that very quickly. So literals get rendered very fast anyway.
So, so the one question, I mean, I'm a little behind in some of the stuff that you've made updates on, obviously, but looking at the standard, I know like going forward, there's this whole notion of standard print to replace cout. And a lot of that goal is stuff that you've already, about, is that, going forward, this BufferWriter type style allows us to render the strings way faster and get them out to the console or the log file or whatever it is much quicker.
Well, yeah, somewhat quicker. Printf's pretty fast. The real thing you're getting here is type safety and not having all these crashes because you passed an int when you thought you were passing a pointer, right?
Oh, sure. All I'm trying to get is that you're still faster. And that was the big argument, is that the formatting logic that we had with printf and making it type safe, which is what we're doing with this new syntax, was a win-win.
Yeah.
And then the real question came out of saying, how can we make it easier to use? And I think the only thing sometimes that might be weird for people is sending up, like in your case here, the W, right? That print, instead of like, can we have a print in a sense? Because that seems to be will be the big disconnect at some future talk. When standard print becomes out, people will say, why do we have it this way versus that way?
Yeah, I mean, you could do it that way. It's pretty trivial, right? Because W is just a variable that's been passed in. So the way you do it is you simply have predefined global externals that are like standard out and standard error, right? So you'd say standard out.print or whatever it is.
Yeah, and this is just a usability question I'm just pulling up here because at some point we're going to be talking, because I think the general feeling will be, if it was me as a library writer, I'm going to say, we're going to want to see if we can bring them as much in line as possible. And then, the value that, depending on if the C++ standard changes somehow, the value we have with BufferWriter is like the stuff you mentioned, like how to deal with IP addresses. I think you're ahead on, as I understand it.
Yeah, now one option, there's always the possibility of a hybrid model where we change the underlying renderer in BufferWriter to the standard format, right?
Well, that's a good idea, yeah.
And just keep the higher level infrastructure.
Sure. My main goal is that, from my perspective, is like a lot of the source code and traffic server could benefit if we could use more standardized code.
Well, that's another reason. Yeah, that's another reason. I'm going to try to find the time to tweak the syntax a little bit to be really just the same as standard format, and then it just works. But in practice, it doesn't matter very much, because it is rare indeed that you'll see anybody use anything except open close brace.
That is true.
Unless it's 0, some index. It's pretty much all you see. It's actually pretty darn rare that people use anything else.
Inside the braces, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a lot of like format specifiers you can add.
Oh, exactly. There's a lot of format specifiers you could add, but do you see anyone actually add them?
Yeah, they're not used a lot. Is what I have. I mean, you use them in certain cases, but they're often not used in the common case, I think, is the argument. I mean, the only thing I can see changing is that if something changes with the language and stuff, where we had and I think there's the support sort of there maybe, but the new Python format string, which require us in C++ to have a similar type of thing where you can just throw the variable in instead. But that's all theory stuff outside the scope of this. So.
Does that mean you can't put like :D inside the braces?
Oh no, you can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So what I was just mentioning was about the new formats. There's a new format string in Python since 3.6, where you say F quote, and then the curly braces are basically embedded Python code at the end of the day.
Yeah,
and
well,
that's actually faster than it technically turns out to be faster than
You were
this, but it's
talking
very
about-
convenient.
You were talking about in Python, people rarely do that.
I think
Well, no, even in the C++ code I've seen using the standard format stuff, you don't, unless you're doing a float, you don't care. Most of the time, you're taking that object, you're turning it into a string, and you're done. Why do you need a
I
format specifier?
guess I use it a lot for time and stuff. Like you kind of have to do it for time.
No, not really. That's what the
Yeah,
wrappers
because
do
the
for you.
default's like ridiculous.
Yeah, but that's what the wrappers do for you. Oh, let's go look at that real quick. Anyway, here's the style formatting. If you actually dig through this, which you won't, you'll find it's almost identical to Python, right? Generic format, binary, decimal, octal, hexadecimal, pointer, string. Do we actually use it anywhere? I'm not sure I have any examples of just, oh, here we go. This says I want the first substitution, I want to print it as a decimal.
Yeah, I just don't know. I don't think I agree that you don't use those. I think you use them often, but I don't know.
Oh, well, show me code that does. I'm just saying in practice, it just hasn't come up for me. It really just doesn't.
I mean, I don't disagree with what Chris is saying. For me, it's like most of the time, things are going as strings, unless you're using a lot of doubles or something. Then I tend to find.
One place it comes up is IP addresses, right? You can see that it does some pretty funky IP address stuff here. But this uses the extension, not the format. Although down here you can see I want to write justify in 20 spaces. Anyway, so so here's date, right? So instance, you take date, you pass in a time key and a format in a string F tile format string, and it deals with it, right? So you can do stuff like this.
Yeah, that's cool.
So yeah, and you just do that, and see again, you don't have formatting show up, I guess. I mean, you could have done it separately and pulled stuff apart. I just use string F time as the formatting here because, well, it's a standard, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're doing it kind of on the other side, but like what I've seen with format is you just give it a chrono timestamp or whatever, and that's what the argument is, and then the format's all inside the spec on the left.
Well, where would you fit it? You get some real syntax problems if you're allowed to put like %H's and %colons. You got colons in here, and so that screws you up too. I'd have to see that. Anyway, but you can do fun things like this. First, you get a list of arbitrary arguments, and it prints the first one that's true. So that makes doing things like this really easy. Name, void. There's optional.
That I do like. That's very functional.
And so this is an arbitrarily long list. It's rare to have more than 2, but it's entirely possible you could have 3 or 4 different things in there. And it just, whichever one is true, that's what you get. Optional is another one. You saw that with the if is based on optional, where you have a Boolean as the first thing, a format string, and then arguments for the format string, and it's nested. And then, this is for doing like suffixes like kilobytes or bytes or something like that. Anyway, it's pretty easy to write a wrapper class. So standard IO, name binding. So there is some documentation for this. It's not completely opaque. Anyway, I think that's probably about it. Any other questions?
Does it Jonathan, didn't you have a question? Or okay. So what can you summarize why you prefer this over like just the IO stream stuff?
Oh, all sorts of reasons. Number one is that in traffic server, so let's be careful. This was built all from the beginning of I want to use it in traffic server.
Right.
And one of the biggest things in traffic servers, you want to write on fixed buffers that pre-exist, that someone else provided. And you really just can't do that with Stream IO. Logging buffers, right? So what happens, you have a big logging buffer, you get allocated a chunk inside that buffer, so you don't even have the whole buffer, and you said print in this range of memory, period.
So did you consider implementing a stream buffer that wouldn't you could avoid allocation? I mean, the standard library.
I looked at that for quite a while, and I think for some reason that I decided it just wasn't going to work. It really just wasn't set up to do that. You had too little control over memory allocation and destruction.
And other things that I've seen about IO streams, there's like, Chevron hell, and then there's also all the formatters and how they are they're difficult to go ahead and use compared to the syntax of like Python. And then also with IO streams and stuff, you have locale issues. I've also heard, people running into that. So if depending on how you have your locale set, depends on how the output's going to be. So if you're expecting so the example that I've seen was in JSON. So you're doing like a JSON for printing out floats, but say your locale set for like Russia, then you get commas and stuff like that instead of actually periods.
And there actually was, when we first did this, I had a big question. Actually, there was discussion at a summit actually about whether we wanted prefix or infix notation, right? So printf is prefix. You put all the formatting and then you put all the data, whereas stream is infix. You mix data and formatting. And the consensus, if I remember correctly, was that people prefer the printf prefix style.
There's a lot of like format versus streams on the GitHub for lib format or format lib. It's pretty interesting. There's a lot of justification there. I think Alan, the symbol bloat is one of them, and then type erasure, lots of code gen around the OStream stuff.
Yeah, I just thought it was hilarious that when I started this lib format was really just in its beginning phases, and that we both decided, well, Python's the way to go. I just thought that was funny. So yeah, that's why it wouldn't take much to get the syntax equivalent, because it's really all just cloned off of Python. But I agree. I like the prefix notation better. It lets me see what I'm printing better.
Well, performance-wise, isn't infix better because you're not parsing the format all the time?
I found parsing the formats really pretty quick. I tried using the pre-parsing, and it's really not much faster.
All right.
You can do some more stuff at compile time too.
Well, BufferWriter does let you create format instances and pre-parse and construct your format strings. But I will tell you this, my experience in working with this is that the rendering of the individual data items is a lot more expensive than parsing the format string. It's a lot more work. Anyway.
I did remember my question as well.
All right.
So I get that this probably isn't an immediate goal, but it's as an operator, not a developer. Does BufferWriter facilitate any kind of transition to like structured logging in any kind of way? Because as an operator, right, if I'm trying to do analytics on the logs, I'm having to write regexes on various log files for patterns that can change between ATS versions, and regex are both expensive to develop and maintain and use.
I'm going to be blunt, so I don't see the connection. You can, for both printf, BufferWriter, and format, you can put any log, you can generate any log string you like. It's really orthogonal. I'm not sure I understand the question.
If it's orthogonal, great. It's a question of, you know, if you're trying to, like, say, for example, just output instead of just a debug string, you know, line by line, can you say, here's a JSON object and it has fields in it, which are all of these parameters and args that you're passing in?
Yeah, well, you could, I mean, you could write a wrapper for that wraps the JSON objects and formats in a particular way, like the date wrapper.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's designed to say, if I want some special formatting for a thing, I will write a wrapper and I will wrap the thing in that wrapper. And it's cheap because the wrapper just has references to stuff, right?
Okay.
It's designed to be a completely transient object. I do that with, actually, for all the YAML parsing in transaction box, I put a wrapper that wraps the mark object from YAML CPP and prints it with the line and character position the way I like it.
Okay.
Which I guess is your example of what you call structured logging, right? So every time I pass that mark, that YAML CPP mark object in, it gets formatted exactly the same way. And another thing we can do, and I know Masuri has, is that BufferWriter supports global name binding. So you can put a name like thread. So you could say brace thread brace in your log, and then it would print the current thread. And then you could make that very standard. That's actually set up in Traffic Server right now. I wish I can remember where those things were. So you can do things like that to say, if you want to have, you know, date, and then you can have these standard substitutions, global substitutions that always format things in the same way.
Jonathan, have you considered using the binary logs for the inputs to your analytics?
Ooh.
We haven't, I believe. I mean, one time I think we did, but I don't believe that is currently the case.
That might be because there's a tool that you can take the binaries and then generate the human readable stuff from it. So it's not like you have to use either or. Like outputting in binary, saving it in binary initially kind of gives you the most flexibility.
Okay. I mean, like, for example, like parent markdown, for example, there's a very specific string that is parent markdown. So we have to have regexes to extract that string out of the big stream of information for when we're using that for alarming and signaling purposes.
So you're parsing within an individual field as opposed to trying to break apart the fields. Is that?
Well, the fields are kind of like all glued together, right? Because it's all just one line in the file.
Well, yeah, but you control the separators in the printed format. You also have that, the format specifier in logging.yaml. I'm not really an expert on logging, so
I'm not either.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the type of logs he's talking about are basically like hard coded output, not the formatted logging that you can define. Like those we're good with. It's ones that like we're looking for warning and error messages basically.
Well, I guess that's a tall order. I mean,
Yeah.
that's why we have that capability for logging, formatting, and binary logs is like you pick what's right for you. It's kind of hard for the pre-canned stuff to serve everyone's needs, or maybe I'm not following what.
That's kind of what I was hoping, like with BufferWriter, is if it's passing in like arg lists to be used in formatters, it's fine that it still has a field that is the rendered output like everyone expects, but having those extra, fields connected for the actual data that you passed in can be really helpful so that you don't have to go through and reparse strings.
Well, you could do that, but again, I think you could do that with anything. It would be really painful in printf because printf is printf. But I think both in BufferWriter and lib format, it would be pretty straightforward. Anyway, here's some code. So, and sort of related to that, this is in traffic server right now. So if in any of these threads, if you put any of your debug messages, you put brace ts-thread brace, it will print the current thread or the current E thread in a standard way. But you can easily add, again, I think in both cases, wrappers to put that extra data in if you want it consistently.